Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPTEL course on materials informatics. In this lecture we will continue our discussion on transfer learning. So just as a recap of what we did in the last lecture, we have sort of motivated the use of transfer learning, since material science and materials engineering is a field that is fairly limited by data availability on properties that are key for performance in several devices. And we found that in order to do transfer learning there are several things that we need to optimize. So such as how do you sample your data points during your fine tuning step, what sort of learning rates you use, whether having more data necessarily helps both in your fine tuning and pre-training steps, and what kind of strategy you use for your fine tuning itself. Do you unfreeze all the layers, give maximal degree of freedom, or do you freeze all the layers and only unfreeze the prediction head, which gives you the lowest degree of freedom. So we found some strategies to work well for transfer learning tasks in materials. So in this lecture we will try to sort of address these three questions, right. So is transfer learning useful in general in the field of materials? Can we get better performance than scratch models? Is there a way to create more generalizable models, since transfer learned models almost always require unfreezing of more layers and they require higher learning rates. So is there a way to create more generalizable models, and is there a practical use, so where you can actually predict a useful property that can actually improve performance in a device using transfer learning. So we will try to answer these three questions in this lecture. Okay. Let us look at whether transfer learning is definitely useful, right, compared to scratch models. In the previous lecture we saw that we considered 7 different material properties. So this is shear modulus, this is phonon frequency, this is formation energy, computed band gap, piezoelectric modulus, dielectric constant, and experimental band gap. So these 6 are all computationally estimated, this is experimentally measured, right. So we considered 7 different properties. So basically we can explore whether transfer learning is useful compared to scratch models by considering 7 by 6 combinations of pairwise transfer learned models, right. So you have 7 properties, so you can consider for GV, right, for shear modulus here you can consider pre-training with shear modulus and then fine tuning on each of these 6 different properties, and same thing for phonon frequency, same thing for formation energies and so on. So you basically can have 7 by 6 or 42 different transfer learned models. So if all of those transfer learned models show better performance than your scratch models, then you establish that transfer learning definitely has utility, right, compared to just training models from scratch. So let us now establish let us try to answer that question, and in order to do that we need to first look at how the scratch models are performing. So all of these squares basically indicate the performance of scratch models on each of the 7 different data sets. 800 basically indicates the data set size. So we basically ensure that we use the same data set size across all the 7 different properties. The notations used are lower triangles correspond to R2 scores and upper triangles correspond to mean absolute errors, right. You generally want higher R2 scores and lower mean absolute errors, so that is why you want bluer lower triangles and redder upper triangles. All the scores listed here are all test scores, right. So they are all scores on the test data set, which is 5-fold cross validated. So you actually split the test set into 5 different slices and you actually measure the performance of the model across those 5 different slices, and then you take an average of them. So these are all 5-fold cross validated scores. Okay. So this is how the scratch models perform. Let us now look at how the pairwise transfer learned models perform. So I know this is a busy slide, so let me try to sort of expand some of the notations here. So the y-axis for this lower square plot basically indicates your pre-training data set, right. So along this row all the models have been pre-trained on experimental band gap, along this row all the models have been pre-trained on dielectric constants, and so on. And for pre-training we use the same number of data sets. So we used 941 data points total for pre-training. So this is again, so for pre-training we use the entire 941 data points, we do not have to split into training and test sets. And then for fine tuning we used 800 data points for all the models, right. So just like the scratch models. So 800 is again the overall data set size, where we split this into 90-10. So 720 is used for fine tuning, and the performance is measured on the remaining 80 data points, right. So the y-axis here corresponds to your pre-training data set. So the x-axis basically corresponds to the fine-tuning data set along with the size of the data set itself. So you see that the size of the data set is the same throughout, right. So basically you can compare the performance of all the models across each column, right. So all of these transfer learned models are trying to predict shear modulus. So you can compare the performance of all of these models and also the corresponding scratch model. Same thing here with phonon frequencies, formation energies, computed band gaps, piezoelectric constants, piezoelectric modulus, dielectric constants, and your experimental band gap, right. The yellow boxes in each of the columns basically indicate the best models. So this is the best performing model that we have amongst all the models, right, amongst all the transfer learned models and the scratch models as well. So yellow boxes indicate the best performing models. So let's look at some of the summaries, right, of this exercise. So the first is that we find that pairwise transfer learned models when data set sizes are capped. So we cap the pre-training data set size to 941, fine tuning data set size to 800. When both of these are capped, we find that pairwise transfer learned models are always better than scratch, right. So the average increase in R2 scores is about 25%. So the average decrease in mean absolute errors is about 16%. So you get anywhere between 16 to 25% improvement on an average across transfer learned models compared to your scratch models, right. And the best models, both transfer learned as well as scratch, the best models we get are for data sets that are more sort of normally distributed, and data sets that are more skewed distributed, we get more average performing models even with transfer learning. So the distribution of data points plays a fairly important role in the performance of your transfer learned models as well. There are other couple of interesting sort of trends that we observed. One is that the specific property that you use for pre-training has very little influence on the actual fine-tuning performance. So for example, here you are trying to predict formation energies. So this is your fine-tuning data set, and you consider two different scenarios where you have pre-trained with phonon frequencies and also pre-trained with band gaps, computed band gaps. So computed band gaps, you would associate them this property to be fairly uncorrelated with respect to formation energies, whereas phonon frequencies can have some correlation, right. So in general, more stable materials will have let's say fewer imaginary modes in your phonon frequencies and so on. So they will have more sort of well defined modes in your phonon frequencies. So there is some amount of correlation between your phonon frequencies and your formation energies. That is what you would expect, right. But we see that whether you pre-train with computed band gaps or whether you pre-train with phonon frequencies, you get very similar performance, right, in your target task of predicting formation energies, right. So we see that specific pre-training property has very little influence on the eventual fine tuning itself, right, and this should hold true as long as the data set sizes are capped, right. So as long as you have limited data sets both for your pre-training as well as for your fine tuning. The other interesting thing that we found was that there is no real symmetry between which data sets during pre-training gives you the best performance during fine tuning and vice versa. So what do I mean by that is, so let's say you are trying to predict experimental band gaps here. The best performance or the best performing model is when the best performance you get is when you pre-train with shear modulus and then you fine tune with experimental band gap, right. So that's when you get the best performance. So for predicting experimental band gap, you need to pre-train with shear modulus, right. But the vice versa is not true. So let's say you pre-train with experimental band gap, right. The best performing model you get is actually for computational band gaps, not for shear modulus. So in fact, for predicting shear modulus, you need to either pre-train with phonon frequencies or formation energies to get the best performance, right. So for predicting experimental band gaps, you need pre-training with shear modulus, but for predicting shear modulus, you need pre-training with formation energies or phonons, not with experimental band gaps. So there is no real symmetry between which property is good during pre-training for a given fine-tuning property and vice versa. So you cannot make the conclusion that because my shear modulus gave me the best performance for predicting my experimental band gap during fine-tuning, the vice versa will be true. You cannot have that expectation here. So there is no real symmetry between which properties are good for pre-training and which properties are good for the corresponding fine-tuning. Okay. So we sort of established that pair-based transfer learning definitely has some utility, but we also established in the previous lecture that during pair-based transfer learning we need to unfreeze most of the layers, and these models have higher learning rates, right. So which implies that the models are not generalizing as well as they should be. Right. So if you now want to create fairly generalizable models, so models that have a fair understanding of structure property relations across a wide range of properties, we cannot simply rely on pair-wise transfer learning, right. So this is where we, in our way to create more generalizable models, we sort of used some inspiration from literature, right, where the authors had used sort of a multitask learning to train their crystal graph convolutional neural network. So we took inspiration from this network, and we sort of came up with the idea that instead of pre-training on one specific property, why don't we pre-train on multiple properties at the same time, right. Maybe this will give us more generalizable models, or models that understand structure property correlations in a more general, in a more efficient manner, right. So to build these models, right, to build models that are trained on multiple properties in one go, we first built a cumulative data set of all the data points that we had, right. So we considered in the previous exercise of pair-wise transfer learning, we considered 7 different data sets. So we actually built a cumulative data set consisting of all the 7 different properties, right, for a given structure, and that leads to about 132,000 data points, right. So many of these data points have overlaps, so we sort of removed overlaps to ensure that each structure is mapped uniquely to all the different properties that are available, either computed or experimentally measured. In order to make this multi-property pre-training a reality, so we sort of put in one-hot encoded vectors for each prediction tasks, right. This basically indicates which property is present or absent for a given structure. So there can be scenarios where for a structure only the formation energy is known, none of the other properties are known, whereas other structures all the 7 properties are known, right. So we don't want to penalize a structure where the other properties are actually not known, right. So lack of knowledge should not be penalizing the performance of the model on that specific structure. So we use this one-hot encoding strategy to basically ensure that if the property is absent for a given structure, it will not add on to the eventual loss function, right, or eventual optimization of the model towards that structure, right. So we basically modified the loss function, so we included this one-hot encoding here, and this is basically taking an average over all the different properties. So these are basically predicted values, these are target values across individual data points and individual properties, right. So we modified our loss function, and for sort of exploring whether transfer learning is still useful, right. So and how well these sort of multi-property pre-training, how well does this actually help us, we pre-trained on all but one property first, and then we fine-tuned on the remaining one property. So we have 7 different properties, so you can pre-train on 6 properties in one time and then fine-tune on the 7th property, and you can repeat this exercise for all the 7 different properties. So just like scratch models, so we get 7 scratch models, we get 7 different multi-property pre-trained models, and we have 42 different transfer learned models, right. So those are the kinds of models that we are going to compare, right. And the models that are multi-property pre-trained, so those that have been trained on multiple properties in one go during the pre-training step, we are going to refer to them as MPT models. So MPT stands for multi-property pre-training. Okay, so let's look at how these multi-property pre-training or MPT models perform compared to pair-wise transfer learned models, right. So here I am showing the performance change or improvement in R2 scores and MAEs here for both the multi-property models as well as the pair-wise models here. So the multi-property models are indicated by the hashes and the pair-wise models are indicated by the solid bars, and the blue bars are R2 scores, the sort of orange bars are mean absolute errors. The baseline in both the plots basically indicate your scratch model performance, right. And this has been done for 5 different data sets. So your 6 different data sets. So your shared modulus, phonon frequencies, formation energies, band gaps, direct to constant, and experimental band gaps, right. Same thing here. So in the case of MPT models, we used, so if you want to predict on GVRH or shear modulus, we pre-trained on all the 6 remaining properties and then we did fine tuning on the shear modulus. Same thing with phonons, same thing with formation energies and so on, right. Whereas in the case of pairwise models, we just took the best, the model that gave us the best performance, right. So whichever property that during pre-training gave the best performance, we basically took that model and then we fine tuned it on our shear modulus, phonon frequencies and so on. So among the 42 different models, we are basically taking the best possible pairwise transfer models here, right. So what are some of the general trends? So we see that in the case of R2 scores, in 3 out of 6 cases, right, we see an improvement in performance with MPT models compared to your pairwise transfer models. And in the case of MAEs, we actually see in 4 out of 6 cases you actually have an improvement in performance in your MPT models compared to your pairwise transfer models, right. So we do see that MPT models do perform better than pairwise transfer learning models on an average, right. There are a couple of instances where we did observe negative transfer. So whenever we were using formation energies or we were trying to predict formation energies using MPT, we found that the models were having some negative transfer. So they were actually performing inferior or poorer compared to scratch models. The reason is because formation energy constitutes the biggest set of data points that we have, right. So if we actually remove these data points from our training data set, the models just do not see enough data to become general enough, right. So that is why these models perform very bad when you exclude formation energy. But otherwise for all the other remaining properties, we see on an average MPT models perform better compared to our pairwise transfer models. We wanted to further see if MPT is truly a way to create more generalizable models. So we put that to task in an out of domain exercise, right. So what we did here was we took our MPT models. So these models are now trained on all the 7 different properties that we considered in our previous exercise. And we compared that against scratch models, which are indicated by the baselines here, and the best pairwise transfer learned models that we have, right. And the out of domain test that we did was we fine tuned all of these models on a band gap of 2D materials, right. So recollect that all the 7 different properties that we have used so far, such as shear modulus, formation energies, band gaps and so on, these are all properties of 3-dimensional materials or regular crystal structures. So we looked at 2D materials. So these are an entirely different class of materials that are not sampled in any of your pre-training steps. So we took these materials and then took their computed band gaps from this Jarvis DFT repository, right. So this has about 1100 data points. So this is very good for our fine tuning exercise, right. So we took our MPT model, so that has been pre-trained on all the 7 different properties. We fine tuned it on the band gap of 2D materials. We did the same exercise for the sort of formation energy model. So this has been pre-trained on formation energies and fine tuned on the 2D material band gap, pre-trained on band gaps, pre-trained on phonon frequencies, pre-trained on shear modulus and pre-trained on experimental band gaps. The sort of brackets indicate the total number of data points that was used in the pre-training step, right. And the left graph basically indicates the improvement in R2 scores. Once again, the baseline is the scratch model. If you are above the baseline, then you are doing better than scratch models. And the right graph basically shows the performance improvements in mean absolute errors. Again, this is baseline is scratch. If you are below the baseline, then you are doing better than scratch, right. And we see that on an average MPT is sort of about 6 to 10% better in both R2 scores and mean absolute errors compared to other pairwise transfer learned models, and definitely significantly better than the scratch models. So with respect to scratch, this is about 6% performance improvement. With respect to scratch, this is about almost 16% performance improvement here, right. The closest performer to our MPT model is actually models that were pre-trained only on formation energies, and this is because formation energy constitutes the biggest data set within MPT itself, right. So since this constitutes the biggest data set, the amount of learning that you get by pre-training just on formation energy is closest to the amount of learning that you get within your MPT model itself, right. But MPT still remains better compared to your formation energy models. So we see that MPT models are the best performance when you are exposing your pre-trained models to out of domain tasks. And hence this provides us a strategy to create fairly generalizable models, right. So here we have considered 7 different types of material properties to do our MPT. So if we include more diverse or different material properties, perhaps we will get even better performance, even better generalization than what we have observed with our MPT models here. So in other words, we have found a more systematic way to improve or create more generalizable models with our MPT framework. Okay, so now that we have established the utility of transfer learning, and we have also established a strategy to create fairly systematic generalizable models using MPT, let us now think about a practical example where transfer learning can actually be useful, right, in an actual device. So the practical example that we will see is in the prediction of rate performance in batteries. So in the case of electrode systems, for example, so you need ions like lithium ions to move from one side to another. So this process is referred to as an atomic migration, right. And if you have a series of lithium atoms going through these migration processes, you basically have a net transport or net movement of lithium across this electrode material, right. And you require this net transport of lithium for you to be able to charge or discharge your battery. So for you to be able to store or release energy from your battery system, right. So the rate at which lithium ions can actually move right across your electrode material basically dictates how quickly you can charge or discharge your battery. So in other words, the rate at which your lithium ions move sort of indicates the rate performance of your batteries, right. And this rate of movement is what is quantified as ionic diffusivity, right. So we are interested in quantifying lithium ionic diffusivity within the bulk phase, right. So within the bulk crystal structure of an electrode material, or in the case of solid state batteries, in the solid electrolyte material, right. So this ionic diffusivity plays a major role in your rate performance. And if you unpack this diffusivity, right, so diffusivity is sort of exponentially governed by this quantity called migration barrier, right. So you have a prefactor term, you have this is Boltzmann constant, this is temperature, so this sort of represents your thermal energy that is available, right. So the prefactor takes into account other properties of your system, so such as carrier concentrations, how many vacancies or interstitials you have for diffusion, how correlated your motion is, and so on. So there the prefactor is non-negligible, it is important, but it is not the most dominant factor. So the most dominant factor, since it sits within this exponent, is your migration barrier or migration energy. So what is this migration energy? So if you look at one sort of isolated migration or hop of lithium, so lithium goes from one of its stable sites to another of its stable sites through an intermediate site, right. So this intermediate site will have a higher energy compared to either of its stable sites, and this energy difference is basically the barrier that lithium has to cross, right, as it goes from one stable site to another, and this barrier in energy is what is basically referred to as the migration barrier, right. And the migration barrier is a material property, so it is actually dependent on the phase of material that constitutes your battery electrode or your solid electrolyte, and since it is a phase dependent property, it is basically dependent on the material, on the moving ion, on the sort of other atoms present in your structure, and so on. So it is a property of that given material or that given phase, right. And if we find ways to determine migration barriers quickly, right, you can basically get an estimate of how easy or difficult it is for ions to move, right, within your electrode or solid electrolyte material, and hence predict the rate performance of a given material in a battery setup. However, getting estimates of this migration barrier is actually quite difficult. So in experiments you can use various techniques such as impedance spectroscopy, nuclear magnetic resonance, and so on, but these have limitations in their ability to characterize a wide range of materials. Same thing with computations as well to a large extent. So we typically use ab initio molecular dynamics or what are called nudged elastic band calculations along with density function theory. But both of these calculations are expensive and they also have convergence difficulties, right. So there are computational challenges with performing these calculations over a wide range of materials. So in other words, your the number of different materials for which the migration barrier has been documented either through computational or experimental means is fairly limited, right. So this provides us a very nice way to explore how useful transfer learning is. So can we use transfer learning to construct models that can basically accurately and swiftly predict these migration barriers, right? So that's the question we will try to answer in the rest of this lecture. So first thing that you pretty much have to do when you have to do a fine tuning exercise is to worry about your data set, right? So we actually created, so our research group basically created a manually curated data set of calculated migration barriers. So these are all obtained from density function theory based calculations for several different systems, for about 620 systems. So we split that carefully into training and test data sets here. So the split is about 90:10. So 90% of the data points go into training and 60% go into testing. So I am just showing the histogram or the distribution of data sets across different structural groups that are commonly observed in battery systems per se. Right. So there are a couple of things that we wanted to ensure when we created this test data set. So we want to ensure that the distribution of the test set is fairly similar to the training data set, right? And we want to ensure that there is no unfair penalization of certain structural classes which are not very well represented in the training data set. So for example, if you just have only 1 or 2 data points within your training data set for a given structural class, we did not include that in our test set because that would unfairly penalize our model. Right, and we ensure that for each given sort of structural group we randomly sampled within the structural group. So each group we randomly sampled, we ensure that there is no unfair penalization of underrepresented groups, and as much as possible we try to ensure that the distributions in our training and test set were fairly similar. So once you have your data set, so one thing that we have to note before doing transfer learning, as we have done before, is that migration is or atomic motion is basically direction dependent. So this is an example of a magnesium manganese or magnesium cobalt silicate material, right? And this material has basically 2 different pathways, right? So the orange spheres basically indicate your magnesium atoms. So magnesium atoms can either move along your A axis or along your C axis here, right? And depending on the direction of motion, they can have 2 different migration barriers. Right, and hence for a given structure the models need to understand the direction of motion as well for them to accurately predict 2 different or 3 different migration barriers, right. So we have to build this knowledge of directionality within our models. So in order to do that within our multi-property pre-training models or our MPT models, what we basically tried out was 4 different modifications to that model. Right. So we basically took out our MPT models. So we first created a replica. So these 2 models are a replica of one another. In one instance of the model we basically feed in the initial structure or the initial configuration of the atom, right, and in the other instance we basically fed in the final instance or the final configuration of atoms that correspond or that constitute the hop of the atom. Right. So here the atom sort of goes from the corner to the center. So the corner configuration goes into the first model here and the center configuration sort of goes into the second instance here. And we basically take embeddings from both of these models and then use that to make the final prediction of the migration barrier. So you see that giving in inputs of initial and final configuration or initial and final images, basically images of the structure, gives some sense of the directionality of motion, right. So this is one model architecture or model modification that we tried out. The other model architecture was we fed in the initial structure and then we took what is referred to as the delta or the difference between the initial and final structure and we fed that to the second instance of the model, right. So this also takes into account initial and final configurational information, but if the way the information is fed is a little different, right. So the delta tries to enhance the varying coordinates, so which atom is actually moving and how much it is actually moving, right. So that is what the delta tries to emphasize to the second instance of the model. And in the third model we used pretty much a band as an input as well as such. So when you typically do natural elastic band calculations along with DFT to predict migration barriers, you will have an initial and a final configuration, and what you do is you create a band of images across these initial and final configurations. the band of images are basically interpolated positions of atoms as it moves from its initial to final state. So you can think of it as capturing the snapshots as the atom actually moves from its initial to the final configuration. So this practice is commonly used in DFT based nudge elastic band calculations. So we took inspiration from that approach and we basically fed in a band itself as an input to our model. So once again we create one instance of the MPT model here, and then we sort of put in the band as the input instead of taking an individual image as an input, right. And the last modification that we tried out was in addition to taking the band as an input, we introduced some attention based pooling mechanisms, right. So in the case of large language models such as ChatGPT and so on, these attention based blocks or pooling blocks are basically used to obtain context of a given word in a sentence. So how important a word is in a given sentence, how related a word is to its adjacent words in a sentence, right. Similarly, if you introduce attention blocks within material structures, the idea is to try and obtain some amount of information on how important a given atom is in influencing the migration barrier as the moving atom is actually moving, right. So you have an atom that is moving within the structure, you have a bunch of neighboring atoms to that moving atom. How important are those neighboring atoms in determining the migration barrier as the moving atom is actually doing its motion within the structure. So the idea was to obtain some kind of contextual information by using these attention blocks along with the band input. So these are the 4 sort of different model modifications that we tried out to introduce the sense of or idea of directionality within our given graph based MPT model. Okay, so let us now look at some of the model performances, right. So here I am showing the 1 minus R2 score. So this is the sort of the inverse of the R2 score here. So the lower 1 minus R2 the better. On the right y axis basically indicates mean absolute errors. Different colors indicate R2 scores and mean absolute errors. So the bluer bars indicate R2 scores, the redder bars indicate mean absolute errors. Do focus on the test scores which are indicated by the hashed blue and the hashed red bars, right. And we plot these statistics for a bunch of different models, right. So the first 2 models are basically classical machine learning models. So this is random forest, this is gradient boosted regression, both are sort of ensemble models. This is basically our scratch model. So our MPT model that has been trained from scratch. So it's just the MPT architecture that has been trained on the migration barrier itself. There is no pre-training that has been done. So this is representative of the scratch model. And then the rightmost column basically indicates the MACE or multi-atomic cluster expansion universal interatomic potential. So we did discuss the origins of MACE in our previous lecture on machine learning interatomic potentials. You can use these architectures such as MACE to predict migration barriers as well. So we basically evaluated the performance of these universal models as is. So without any fine tuning or any sort of updation of these models on their predictions of the migration barriers. And then the 4 models in between are the architectural modifications that we tried out with our MPT models. The first 2 contain just images as inputs, so models 1 and 2 here, and models 3 and 4 basically take bands as inputs, right. So the main takeaway message is that the best performing model is actually our model 3. So which takes into account the band as an input without any attention, right. So the second best performing model is actually the model 3 with attention or model 4, right, but we have best performance with our model 3, right. In terms of statistics, we see that model 3 has about 0.7 in terms of R2 scores and mean absolute errors of about 0.26 EV, right. These statistics are not the best, but these can probably improve or will likely improve with more number of data points that we can generate for our migration barriers. The nice thing to note about model 3 is that it actually identifies multiple pathways in a given structure. So it is able to generalize fairly well and understand the directionality of motion for different ions within different structures. So we can also look at how well model 3 actually generalizes. So in order to understand that, we looked at how well the model actually performs under 3 different scenarios. So I am plotting the absolute errors here under 3 different scenarios. The important ones, the important points to sort of observe are the circles and the horizontal lines here, which represent the mean and the median of the distribution. Right. So scenario A, which is represented by blue here, is basically generalization across different migration pathways in a given structure. So you show the model one of the pathways in a given structure, and you ask the model to make a prediction on a different pathway within the same structure as part of the test set. So if you take magnesium, manganese silicate that I showed before, you show one of the directions during training, and the other direction you put it in the test set and ask the model to actually make a prediction on the different direction, right? And we are basically plotting the errors for all such data points that we could find. Right, within our test set here. So we are basically trying to evaluate the generalization of migration pathways across different structures, across different directions within a given structure. In scenario B, we are trying to do this generalization across different intercalent compositions. What we mean by that is, so let's say you have the same structure, you have the same moving ion, but you have different concentrations of the moving ion within your structure itself. So we take one such composition, let's say the charged composition in our training, right. So charged composition usually indicates that there are fewer electroactive ions or moving ions within your given material, right. Discharge composition generally refers to more moving ions within your given structure. These two terminologies are commonly used in battery literature. Right. So sort of examine generalization across composition, right. So what we end up doing is we take in some compositions, like let's say the charge compositions, and show that model during training, and then we ask the model to make predictions on the corresponding discharged composition, or vice versa. So we show the model the discharge composition and we ask it to make predictions on the charge composition. So this basically tells us how well the model can actually generalize across different compositions within the same structure. Scenario C is basically generalization across different chemistries, right. So let's say you have a structure, let's say a lithium containing structure, you show that you show the structure with lithium during training, and then you ask the model to make a prediction on the same structure but with a different moving ion such as magnesium. Right. So this could be, for example, lithium manganese oxide. You show lithium manganese oxide during training, and then you ask the model to make a prediction on magnesium manganese oxide during testing. You can also think about other variations in chemistry such as transition metal. So you have changes in transition metal but with the same structure, or you have changes in your anion, your oxygen, sulfur and so on, but with the same structure, right. So this is basically generalization across chemistries. So we evaluated how well the model generalizes across these 3 different scenarios, and we found that the model actually generalizes fairly well across these 2 scenarios, so across different compositions and different chemistries. In fact, the model has the most difficulty in actually generalizing across different migration pathways within the structure, right. So direction of motion is what the graph networks seem to have the hardest in sort of understanding or generalizing across. Compositions and chemistries, they seem to understand fairly well. Right. So how barriers sort of vary with respect to compositions and chemistries, they understand better compared to directions, right. So this sort of indicates that model 3 in general seems to generalize fairly well, and this sort of builds upon the fact that if you use transfer learning in a proper fashion, so if you create generalizable models, such as MPT models, and then you induce or introduce some architecture modifications for your problem at hand, and then you do proper fine tuning, you can create models that are fairly good, right, in making predictions on a property that can be very difficult to get an estimate on. So we also examine the ability of this model 3, our best performing model, to classify structures, right. So this is a simple classification task, and when you do classification you need to define a certain threshold, right. So we said that if migration barrier for a given structure and given structure pathway combination is less than 0.65 eV, then it is considered a good conductor. If it is above 0.65 eV, then it is considered a bad conductor, right. So good is EM less than 0.65, bad is EM greater than 0.65. There are sort of battery reasons, design reasons why you want to use 650 eV. but this is usually a good sort of rule of thumb, right. Once again, the sort of lower triangles indicate training metrics, and the tests, and the upper triangles indicate test metrics. Y-axis is basically the actual target values, x-axis is predicted values, right. So you want to maximize the predictions across this diagonal. So you want to get the true negatives, and you also want to get the true positives as much as possible, right. So the importance is to focus on the test data sets here, or test statistics here. And the main takeaway message is that we get our model to be about 80% accurate. So model 3 classifies 80% of the test data points, so data points that it has not seen before, accurately as either true good diffusers or bad diffusers, right. So if you have random chance, right, you will get about 50% accuracy. So we are definitely way above random chance. So we have about an accuracy of 80% in classifying good and bad ionic conductors or ionic diffusers. In terms of precision, we are able to identify good conductors slightly more precisely compared to that of bad conductors. So the model is able to identify good conductors slightly better compared to that of bad conductors. So with this, we sort of see that model 3, the best performing model that we have, can actually be a very good classifier as well. So this can be put to use in identifying good conductors, thereby identifying materials that have very good performance, very good rate performance when they are used in a battery setting, right. So we now see that, if you use transfer learning with appropriate training, pre-training, as well as fine tuning steps, appropriate strategies, appropriate architectural modifications, transfer learning can lead to very powerful models that can actually result in very good improvements in identification of materials and eventual performance improvement in actual devices. So within our hands-on session, which will follow this lecture, we will do a simple pairwise transfer learning exercise using the Align architecture that has been introduced in this lecture. We will do a simple example of pre-training on formation energy, and we will do fine tuning on the phonon frequencies, right. So we will try to understand how to do pre-training in practice, and also how to do fine tuning in practice. So we will use up the actual Align architecture, but we will do a simple pairwise transfer learning exercise. So once you understand how this pairwise transfer learning exercise is done, you can then go about doing modifications, introducing MPT, and then using it for other data sets as well. With that, we will summarize and close this lecture. So material science is limited by data availability, especially on key properties, and transfer learning can be a path to mitigate or reduce this data availability problem. In the last lecture, we looked at optimal pre-training fine tuning strategies. In this lecture, we found multi-property pre-training, or MPT, to be a pathway for generalizable models. We found that MPT models on an average perform better than pairwise transfer learning models. They perform really well on out of domain data sets, and we also looked at a practical use case where you can use these MPT models, introduce some small modifications in their architecture, and use them for a practical task of predicting migration barriers in battery materials, which can lead to rate performance improvements in practical lithium-ion batteries and other battery technologies. So with that, we come to an end on our discussion of transfer learning. In our next lecture, we will look at diffusion models, which can be used for generating structures for a given property. So they can be used for inverse design approaches towards designing and discovering materials for different applications. So with that, I thank you all for joining today's lecture. I will see you all in the next one.